Good morning, SRD world. This morning I wanted to go over BioHorizon Implant Prosthetics. What we have here are the three different options that BioHorizons, which is an implant company, has provided to us to take impressions for implant prosthetics, or more specifically, crowns, bridges, all-on-fours, what have you. Each company has different solutions. I will say BioHorizons has a very good cross-section of solutions. And I wanted to go over those here, maybe not so much on how to do it, but what the parts are and how to distinguish the different parts from each other. These are the impression components or impression copings. What we don't have here is the digital scan, the scan body. These are the analog solutions, meaning PVS impression, so a conventional impression. If we decide to do a digital impression with the iTero scan, we do have a scan body that is different than these three here, and we'll do a different video on that. But if the doctor decides to do an analog version with conventional impression material, these are the tools we have available to us. I have chosen to only have in the practice the direct and indirect copings, and not necessarily the snap copings. The reason for that is snap copings have been shown over time to be less accurate than the direct copings or the indirect copings, the metal components. The snap copings have these plastic components that snap into place. They've gotten a lot better over the years, so it's very possible that the difference between the two is negligible from a clinical perspective. I still rely on the old tried and true. I have a lot more confidence in these particular metal-based impression copings. So, what is the difference between a direct and indirect? Most of you have heard the term open tray and closed tray. Direct is a open tray method. Indirect is a closed tray method. Open tray is a technique where we will take a plastic impression tray and drill a hole through it so that when we do the impression, this impression coping will poke through the impression material and the tray so that we can remove the screw. And then when we take the impression out of the patient's mouth, the coping is taken out with the impression at the same time. That's an open tray or direct method. The other way, which has been proven to be just as accurate, although I'm less confident in it, is the indirect, where the impression coping will go on the implant, the impression will be made, and the impression is removed, and the coping stays on the implant. We can think of the indirect as being the same as a regular crown and bridge impression, where we put our cord in and take impression of a tooth. Here we're taking an impression of the impression coping. Take it out, then we unscrew the coping and then insert it into the impression outside of the patient's mouth, or we send them separate. We send the impression coping separate from the impression, and the lab will reinsert it back in. I feel that the reinsertion step leaves the potential for error, and that's why I don't necessarily prefer or recommend the indirect or closed impression tray method for implant prosthetics. With that said, we have these impression copings here because there are times when we need to do that. When is that important? You're doing an impression on number 31, you can't get the driver in the patient's mouth like you would with a direct pickup coping to get the screw out. So there are times when you really have to rely on the indirect or the closed tray method. So we do have these impression copings. Our first line of method for taking impressions for implant crowns would be the direct or the open tray method. One way I can tell the difference between an impression coping that is indirect and direct is the shape on the impression coping itself. Obviously, I'm not able to pull out the impression because the impression material goes underneath these flanges. It would tear the impression material. It'd be very hard to get the impression out. Whereas this coping is designed to be removed with the impression coping staying in the patient's mouth. So if you're ever looking at an impression coping and you don't know what kind it is, you can somewhat deduce which one it is based upon the design of the coping itself. This design is meant to stay with the impression material as you remove the impression material from the patient's mouth. All right. In a nutshell, the way this is done, you screw this into the patient's mouth, you do the impression. This screw is poking through the material and the tray. When the material is set, the doctor will unscrew this, thereby disengaging the coping from the implant so that when the impression tray is removed from the patient's mouth, the whole thing comes out as one piece. The doctor doesn't need to necessarily remove the entire screw. This screw will come out. It just needs to be loosened to the point we hear the click that tells us that the screw threads have disengaged from the internal screw threads of the implant, thereby releasing the impression coping from the implant, so that when you take it out of the patient's mouth, the whole thing comes out. I'm trying to say this in many different ways to try to articulate the difference between the two. The other thing I wanted to go over is the difference between hexed and non-hexed. Every implant system will have some version of hexed or indexed and non-hexed or non-indexed. In a nutshell, the only times we use non-hexed or non-indexed is when we're doing a bridge impression, implant-supported bridge, where we don't want the rotational components to be locked in. I'm not going to use this particular platform to describe the difference between the two. I want everybody to understand if you're doing a single unit crown, which should be 95 to 98% of the time, you're using hexed components. If you use a non-hexed on a single implant, you're going to get a call from the lab and they're going to say, we can't use this particular impression coping for this particular situation. There's also the platform diameters. If you watch some of the other videos I've done on the BioHorizon prosthetic platforms and platform switching, you'll get a sense of what the differences are between here. But this is a video specifically on the impression coping types, direct, open tray, what have you. From there, we will be much better at selecting the right impression coping for the right clinical situation. I hope all this makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or anybody else that's got this stuff mastered. All right, hope all is well and talk to you soon.